The green light on the dyno test stand flickered once, twice, and then steadied, and the engineer watching it should have stopped the run right there. He didn't. He let the engine spin through another full cycle, noted the horsepower reading on his clipboard, and signed his name to a sheet of paper that would eventually land in the hands of Japan's transport ministry. That signature was the moment a brand built on the idea of perfect quality began its slow, sickening slide toward the edge of a cliff. You need to understand what was at stake, because the name on that clipboard belonged to a company whose entire identity was the absence of mistakes. This wasn't some fly-by-night parts shop cutting corners to save a few yen. This was a supplier tethered to the most respected car maker on Earth, a partnership that had survived decades, market crashes, and the kind of corporate pressures that break lesser alliances. And it nearly ended because of a test, not a crash test, not a durability test, a horsepower test, a test that someone decided should look smoother than reality. What you're about to hear is the story of how a reputation built over generations came within inches of being erased, and it wasn't a competitor, an economic crisis, or a stroke of bad luck that did it. It was something far more internal, far more human, and far more disturbing than anything the public image ever suggested. The trail runs from a test room in Japan to the inspection officers who raided a corporate headquarters, and it ends with a confession that makes you question every badge of quality you've ever trusted. The year was 2024, and the name on the news was Daihatsu, a Toyota-owned car maker that had just admitted to manipulating safety tests for 3 decades. 3 decades. That's longer than many of the engineers working in that facility had been alive. The admission wasn't about one bad batch of parts or a single faulty model. It spanned 64 makes of vehicles, woven through the entire history of the company's modern production. And the scale of it left executives stammering in front of cameras because there was no way to spin it. Here's where you have to stop and feel the weight of that number. 64 makes, 30 years. When they say a culture of silence had taken root, they aren't speaking metaphorically. Someone in that building at some point in the 1990s decided that a slightly altered test result was better than an honest failure. And then someone else did it again and again. Each time the lie got a little heavier, a little more impossible to admit, until the only way forward was to keep stacking the same lie on top of itself. You've seen this happen before, haven't you? Maybe not on a factory floor, maybe not with lives on the line, but you've watched a system quietly agree to look the other way. You've sat in a meeting where the numbers were adjusted, where the phrasing was softened, where nobody wanted to be the one to say the thing everyone was thinking. The cold knot in your stomach told you it was wrong, and you said nothing. That's exactly what was happening inside Daihatsu, except the cost of silence was measured in thousands of workers, 423 suppliers, and the trust of millions of drivers. Now hold that thought, because the story doesn't stop where the official narrative stops. The official story says Daihatsu cheated, Daihatsu got caught, Toyota apologized. But that version leaves out the strangest part of the whole ordeal, the part that investigators are still chewing on. Because when you look at the dates, when you look at what was tested and what wasn't, a contradiction emerges that makes everything else look like a distraction. The question isn't how they got away with it for 30 years. The question is why they kept doing it long after the risk of discovery had become a certainty. That's the loop we're going to chase down, and it leads somewhere you won't see coming. Here's where the story twists in a way the headlines didn't capture. The certification scandal that broke in 2024 wasn't the first time this family of companies had been singed. Go back to 2010, and you'll find Toyota itself tangled in a nightmare of unintended acceleration, a recall controversy that pinned the blame on a U.S. supplier named CTS Corporation. The pedals, the floor mats, the hearings, the way a reputation can turn to ash in a single news cycle. It was a close call for Toyota, and it should have served as a warning to every supplier in their orbit about what happens when quality questions surface. That contradiction about the CTS timeline isn't just a footnote. It's the crack in the official story that most people drove right past. Subscribe and stick with us, because this is the kind of detail we chase down until the real pattern surfaces. Drop the word timeline in the comments if you caught what didn't add up there, and tell me who you think was actually on the hook. Now consider the timing. CTS's chief executive, Vinod Khilnani, stood up and said his company didn't even become a Toyota supplier until 2005, while the recalled vehicles went back to 2002. Think about what that means. The company taking the public blame wasn't even in the picture for some of the earliest affected cars. Something in that equation doesn't add up, and it tells you how desperate the situation was. When the pressure arrives, the instinct isn't to search for the truth. The instinct is to find someone to carry the weight. That was the first hint that the relationship between Toyota and its suppliers was not the picture-perfect arrangement the public believed. Underneath the gleaming surface of lean manufacturing and the famous Toyota way, there was something else, a pressure so intense that it could bend the ethics of an entire organization. And if you think this was unique to CTS or Daihatsu, you're about to learn how wrong that assumption is. You're gripping the steering wheel of your car right now, and you don't think about the chain of hands that put it together. You trust the badge on the hood. You trust the name that has spent decades telling you it would never let you down. That trust is exactly what was being traded away, one falsified test at a time, inside rooms no customer would ever see. Let's go back into that room, to the moment it all became undeniable. The inspection officers arrived at Toyota's headquarters on the 4th of June in 2024, and here's the detail that should make your skin crawl. They weren't there for Daihatsu. They were there for Toyota itself. The transport ministry's sweep had widened to include not just Toyota, but Mazda, Honda, Suzuki, and Yamaha Motor, a cascade of certification irregularities surfacing across the entire Japanese automotive industry. One subsidiary's shame had become a searchlight sweeping over the whole landscape, and when the light landed on Toyota's own testing procedures, the company conceded something that its engineers had spent years trying to manage. Toyota admitted that irregularities had occurred during horsepower output testing for 3 diesel engine models. Those engines powered 10 vehicle models globally and 6 models in Japan. 10 models. That's not a rounding error. That's a manufacturer standing in front of the world and admitting that the numbers it had certified weren't the numbers the engines actually produced. Here's where the technical detail matters, because it tells you the deviousness of what was happening. Toyota confessed that the testing used engine control units, the ECUs, with software that differed from what was used in mass production. They set up the test with different software so the results would appear smoother, with less variation. Less variation. That phrase is the smoking gun, because in the world of quality control, variation is the enemy. A smooth test result says the engine is consistent, reliable, predictable, and the only way to achieve that smoothness was to cheat. You've felt this before, in a different context. You've seen someone polish a report until it looked flawless, and you just knew, that the flaws were still there, hidden under the veneer. That's what appears smoother with less variation actually means. It means they chose the appearance of quality over the reality of it. And when the reality finally surfaced, it didn't just damage one engine line. It called into question the entire foundation of certification, every badge, every seal, every promise that came with it. Now ask yourself the question that investigators were asking. If they were willing to cheat on the horsepower test, what else were they willing to fudge? The answer to that question is where this story descends into something darker than a simple quality scandal. Because the pattern wasn't confined to one rogue engineer or one desperate manager. This was systemic. It survived leadership changes. It survived internal audits. It survived the near miss of 2010 that should have taught everyone the cost of cutting corners. The lie had become the culture, a culture so entrenched that even when the danger was fully known, nobody had the nerve to stop it. Consider the human side of that choice. Inside Daihatsu, there were 9,000 workers in Japan whose livelihoods depended on the company's continued operations. 9,000 people who clocked in every day, many of them unaware of what their managers were signing off on. When the scandal broke and production paused, those 9,000 workers faced an uncertain future, not because the cars were unsafe in the way headlines screamed, but because the trust that held everything together had been betrayed. And then think about the 423 domestic suppliers with direct business relationships with Daihatsu, 423 companies that had staked their own futures on the automotive giant. When the plant shutdown came, that ripple spread outward. Small machine shops, parts fabricators, logistics firms, all of them wondering whether their own survival was now in question. One falsified test in one building didn't just threaten a reputation, it threatened an ecosystem. If you've ever watched a company weather a scandal, You've seen the choreography of the apology, the bowed heads, the rehearsed statements, the promise to do better. What you rarely see is the truth underneath, the pressure that created the scandal in the first place. And that pressure, in this case, was the relentless obsession with perfection itself. This is the paradox that breaks the official story wide open. Toyota built its empire on the Toyota production system, the lean manufacturing philosophy that eliminated waste, empowered workers, and became the gold standard for factories worldwide. It was studied, it was copied, it was revered, but the same system that produced world-class efficiency also produced an environment where admitting a failure felt like a mortal sin. When perfection is the only acceptable outcome, the incentive to hide imperfection becomes overwhelming. That paradox, where the pursuit of flawlessness manufactures the very cracks it exists to prevent, isn't unique to one factory floor. It's the same pattern that quietly eats through markets, algorithms, and every system that mistakes rigidity for strength. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on the hidden mechanics that connect boardrooms to trading floors. Drop a single word in the comments. Perfection. Tell me a place you've watched a system's greatest virtue mutate into its deepest liability. You see where this is heading. The supplier that nearly destroyed Toyota's reputation wasn't a villain in the classic sense. It was a mirror, reflecting back everything the car maker's own culture had demanded. The desire for flawless results, the intolerance for variation, the pressure to never, ever disappoint. And when human beings are placed inside a system that makes honesty unbearable, they will find a way to make the numbers work, even if it means breaking the truth to save it. So the question you're left holding is the one that matters more than any fine or any recall. How do you build a system that demands excellence without creating the conditions for deception? There's a moment every leader faces, and if you've been in any position of responsibility, you know exactly what it looks like. You're looking at a report that doesn't quite meet the target. The options are clear. You can flag the problem, absorb the cost, delay the launch, or you can make a small adjustment, tell yourself it's insignificant, and move forward. The first option preserves your integrity. The second option preserves your schedule. And in the moment, the second option always feels smarter. That emotion, the desperate need to stay on track, is what opened the door to 30 years of fraud. Think about what it means that Daihatsu's manipulation wasn't caught for 3 decades. 3 decades of engineers running the same test, knowing the result was false. 3 decades of managers reviewing the data, choosing not to ask the question that would unravel everything. 3 decades of workers who suspected, who maybe even mentioned it to a colleague, and then swallowed it down because the alternative was too costly. That's not one bad apple, that's an orchard. And yet, here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The cars themselves were not necessarily dangerous. The tests were falsified, but the actual vehicles on the road didn't show a pattern of catastrophic failures. That's the maddening part. The deception wasn't covering up deaths. It was covering up mediocrity, inconsistency, engines that didn't perform quite as advertised, which makes the whole thing worse, in a way. They risked their entire reputation, the trust of the entire world, not to hide a lethal defect, but to hide the fact that their engines weren't quite as good as they claimed. Let me walk you through the weight of that choice, because it changes the moral calculus of everything that follows. A defect that kills can be explained as a tragic mistake. A fabrication performed simply to make results look smoother is a choice made in cold blood. The engineers who altered those ECUs weren't responding to an imminent safety crisis. They were responding to a performance target, and the decision to cheat was made deliberately, repeatedly, and with enough coordination across the organization that it couldn't have been the work of a single rogue actor. This is the pattern that investigators from Japan's transport ministry were looking for when they widened their sweep. They knew instinctively that a single test irregularity was almost never isolated. And they were right, because as the inspection spread, it caught not just Toyota and Daihatsu, but Honda, Mazda, Suzuki, and Yamaha Motor. Suddenly, the story wasn't about one bad supplier. It was about an entire industry that had grown comfortable with the idea that certification was a formality, not a promise. You're starting to see the shape of it now, aren't you? The official story says this was a Toyota supplier scandal. The deeper truth is that it was a systemic failure of trust across an entire sector, one that was only revealed because a single target, a deadline, or a whistleblower finally broke the cycle. What's remarkable is how long the lie held, and why it finally collapsed is a lesson in the physics of deception. So let's go back to that engine test one more time, because the detail of the software is what sealed everything. The engineers didn't just fudge a number on a chart. They wrote new software specifically designed to make the test produce smoother results. That's a plan. That's a conspiracy of conscious choice. Someone had to write that code, test it, approve it, and use it. At every step, someone could have stopped. At every step, someone chose to keep going. This is where the story opens its second and most uncomfortable question. Why would rational, presumably ethical people keep making the same decision for 30 years? Why would they double down on a lie that had become a sword hanging over their heads? The answer lies in something called the escalation of commitment, the quiet trap that keeps people pouring resources into a failing course of action, simply because they've already invested so much. You know this feeling. You've stayed in a job, a relationship, a partnership, long past the point where it made sense, because leaving meant admitting that all the time you'd already spent was wasted. That's the mechanism at work here. Once the first test was falsified, the only way to justify that first lie was to keep lying. Stop, and you confess to 30 years of fraud. Keep going, and maybe, just maybe, no one will ever notice. The question you have to sit with is whether you would have had the courage to break that cycle. Not someone braver than you, not a fictional whistleblower. You, in that room holding the clipboard, knowing that one honest signature would unravel everything, because that is the real threshold of the story. That is where the reputation of the world's most trusted car maker and its suppliers hung in the balance. And on the 4th of June, 2024, when the inspectors walked through the doors of Toyota's headquarters, the cycle finally broke. Not because someone inside found the courage to tell the truth, but because the truth had become too big to hide anymore. Here's what that looked like from the outside. Toyota chairman Akio Toyoda, the grandson of the founder, the living symbol of the company, had to stand in front of cameras and apologize. His face, broadcast across the world, became the image of a legacy crumbling. Because the kind of apology he had to offer wasn't for a defect or a failure. It was for a lie, and a lie, once it's exposed, doesn't simply disappear. It becomes the thing you are known for. But here's the part of the story that the cameras didn't show, the part that makes this more than a corporate scandal. When the Daihatsu division paused production and stopped shipments, the silence that followed wasn't just the silence of stopped machinery. It was the silence of 9,000 workers waiting to hear if their jobs still existed. It was the silence of 423 supplier companies waiting to learn if years of relationship were about to dissolve. A single dishonest test had frozen an entire economy in limbo. Remember that cold knot I mentioned earlier? The feeling you get when you know something is wrong and nobody is listening. That's what was living inside those workers, except they didn't have the luxury of closing a tab and walking away. They had mortgages, they had families, they had the weight of a system that had told them, in ways spoken and unspoken, that the test results were not their concern. They just had to do their jobs. You see, the tragedy of the Toyota supplier scandal isn't that a few bad actors cheated. The tragedy is that thousands of honest people were trapped inside a dishonest system, and the system's survival depended on their silence. They didn't write the falsified software. They didn't sign the altered reports, but they knew. And knowing while doing nothing is its own kind of complicity, the quiet kind that lets scandals grow for 30 years. That feeling of knowing something is wrong but staying quiet, the cold knot in your stomach, is not just a manufacturing plant thing. It's the same mechanism that lets toxic positions build in a portfolio while every chart is screaming reversal. If you want to keep mapping these hidden systems so you stop being the one trapped inside them, subscribe to this channel now. Drop the word silence in the comments if you've ever watched a trade turn against you and felt powerless to act, even though you knew the signal was there. Now the story tightens, because the same pattern was playing out in 2010 when Toyota faced the unintended acceleration crisis. The part that gets lost in that older story is just how close it came to destroying everything, and how the blame was distributed in ways that don't match the headlines. Toyota singled out CTS Corporation's pedals, but they exonerated Denso, another maker of the same component. And CTS's chief executive sat there with the world's media watching and said his company wasn't even a Toyota supplier until 2005, while some of the recalled cars went back to 2002. Let that dissonance sit for a moment. The company accepting the crown of blame publicly carried a narrative that didn't line up, and yet no one in power seemed interested in chasing the inconsistency. Why? Because the priority wasn't the truth. The priority was survival, finding a place to plant the flag of responsibility so that the brand could move forward. CTS was the sacrifice. The relationship was the priority, and the pattern of prioritizing the brand over the truth was the same pattern that would later bloom in full inside Daihatsu's test rooms. This is the through line you have to see. The 2010 crisis and the 2024 scandal are not separate events. They are 2 points on the same curve. At every step in between, Toyota's culture had a choice: face the uncomfortable truth about its relentless perfectionism, or double down on the image. And time after time, it chose the image. You have to decide what you think about that choice, because it reveals something uncomfortable about every system you trust, from the car you drive to the food you eat to the software running your phone. Every certificate, every badge, every seal of approval is a promise made by fallible humans under pressure, and the pressure to appear perfect is the single greatest enemy of being honest. The mechanism that nearly destroyed Toyota's reputation wasn't a broken part. It was a broken relationship between reality and appearance. And you've seen that fracture in your own life, even if you've never been inside a factory. You've watched a friend post a perfect life online while their real life was crumbling. You've seen a company champion its culture while employees whispered about the toxicity behind closed doors. You've been inside organizations where the smartest career move was to keep your head down and let the numbers speak, even when the numbers lied. So here is the uncomfortable, unambiguous answer to the question this story has been circling. What nearly destroyed the supplier's reputation and dragged Toyota to the brink with it was not a specific defect, not a single bad engineer, not a cost-cutting decision. It was the cumulative weight of a culture that made honesty untenable. The reputation was destroyed not by falling short of perfection, but by being unable to admit it did. The scar that remains on Toyota is not the kind that heals cleanly. The certification process across the entire Japanese auto industry is now viewed with suspicion. Regulators who were once willing to accept an audit at face value now dig deeper, and the suppliers, the thousands of small companies that form the backbone of the industry, they understand something new. They understand that their relationship with the giant they feed is built on a foundation that can crumble without warning. Remember what it felt like when you first heard the news of the scandal. That jolt of disbelief, that instinct to defend the brand you trusted, the slow, sinking recognition that the company you believed in was human, fallible, pressured, willing to lie. That feeling, that's what an entire nation experienced. And it didn't just happen in Japan. It rippled across the world, through every dealership, every owner, every person who had ever bought into the idea that a badge on a hood means something absolute. The last image you should carry from this story isn't the bowed head of an executive or the empty factory floor. It's the quiet night after the inspectors left, in the office of a mid-level engineer, one of the ones who knew, who never spoke, who watched 30 years of deception unfold from the inside. He's sitting alone, staring at his monitor, replaying every report he'd ever signed his name to, wondering if the next knock at the door would be for him. That silence, that waiting, that is the true smell of a scandal, the burnt smell of denial that lingers long after the shouting stops. Tell me in the comments where you first felt the rug shift. Was it when the inspector's car pulled into Toyota's headquarters, or later when you realized how deep the roots went? Drop your answer below. And think about this as you close the video. If persuasion is this powerful in a multi-billion-dollar company, what is it doing quietly to you?